Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. Dana White in the UFC has been very adamant that we are getting Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington before the end of 2023, and that Colby Covington will be getting the next welterweight title shot, even though there are much more deserving contenders. Number one on that list being Belal Muhammad. And when I continue to see people justify Colby Covington getting a title shot, they keep saying, well, Colby Covington is a bigger draw. Well, in this video, we are going to determine how big of a draw really is Colby Covington. And I believe I can make the argument that Belal Muhammad, under a certain set of circumstances, is a bigger draw than Colby Covington. And we're going to look at legitimate evidence. We're not just going to blindly speculate for the entire video. I'm going to speculate in this video, but we're going to actually look at evidence and numbers that we have available to us. So first off, what is actually a draw? Well, it's kind of a loose term, but it basically means how many tickets can you sell to a live event, and also your pay-per-view buy rate. Essentially, if you're headlining a pay-per-view, how many pay-per-view buys can you sell? You know, Conor McGregor is known as the biggest draw. He always sells over 1 million pay-per-view buys. And people keep insisting that Colby Covington is some massive draw, much more, substantial than Belal Muhammad. We're going to look at that in a little bit, but I want to briefly go over the argument of the number one contender, because I keep hearing people say, Belal Muhammad doesn't deserve a title shot. He couldn't even stop a one-armed Gilbert Burns. And I just think this is an absolute ridiculous argument. Belal Muhammad is on a 9-fight winning streak. His last 4 fights, all those fighters are currently ranked in the top 15. Colby Covington's on a 1-fight win streak. He has no wins on his UFC resume against fighters who are in the current top 15. None. 0. He hasn't fought since March of last year. Over a year ago. He's been hiding in witness protection. His last win was against Jorge Masvidal. And I said this in other videos, and I'll link all the other videos I've done on this topic, but I wanted to briefly cover this early. You look at Belal Muhammad's last 4 fights, Gilbert Burns, which we're going to talk about in depth here in a second. You go back to the Gilbert Burns fight at UFC 288. That was the most recent fight. Then you go back before that, UFC 280, Sean Brady. Then you go back before that, Vicente Luque. Before that, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Those 4 wins are better than Colby Covington's entire MMA resume. Those 4 wins alone. And he's on a 9-fight winning streak. And people keep attempting to delegitimize his win at UFC 288 against Gilbert Burns because he stuffed a takedown midway through the first round. Gilbert Burns lands on his shoulder, has an injury on his shoulder, and then he 50-45 Gilbert Burns for the rest of the fight, won every single round. And essentially people are saying, well, you had an injured Gilbert Burns, you couldn't finish him? Well, first off, we don't know the entirety of the injury was caused strictly on the one takedown defense. Maybe it was. I'm not here to defend that say it wasn't. But we don't know if it was an injury caused there and then it was substantially made worse by the kicks and punches to the guard of Gilbert Burns and the different exchanges they had throughout the fight, because Burns shot in on a couple more takedowns in that fight. But nonetheless, for the people saying that, look, Belal Muhammad couldn't finish a one-armed Gilbert Burns, I want to show you how stupid that narrative is based on me reshaping the narrative for Belal Muhammad in his favor. Belal Muhammad off the couch, celebrating Ramadan, off the couch with one leg, 50-45 Gilbert Burns, who had a full training camp. Think about how dumb that sounds. And when you add context to it, Gilbert Burns had a full training camp, but it was for Jorge Masvidal, and then he was off for 2 weeks before he got this fight, so he kind of, might have blown up a little bit in weight. But you can kind of shape the narrative however you want. At the end of the day, both these guys took the fight. Gilbert Burns was more in shape than Belal Muhammad because he just came off a fight. And you had a Belal Muhammad who came in with an injury. It was not an injury caused in the fight, came in with a leg injury. And he 50-45 Gilbert Burns, who is a top contender. A top contender. Beat him up all 5 rounds. There was like the second round, I think, that was kind of close where you could have gave it to Gilbert Burns. But nonetheless, Belal Muhammad outstruck him for the entire fight. The entirety of the fight. And I just think to act like an injury that was caused in a fight delegitimizes a win, I just think is completely ridiculous. And the win over Gilbert Burns for Belal Muhammad is better than any win that Colby Covington has on his entire resume, because people basically are giving Colby Covington a participation trophy title shot. That is exactly what is going on here. They are giving him a participation trophy title shot because he has 2 losses to Kamaru Usman. That is the truth. And then they justify it by saying that Colby Covington is some massive draw. And if we're just giving fights based on being a draw, why don't we just cancel Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler? Let's give Conor McGregor the title shot against Leon Edwards, if that's what we're doing here. You know, that's not how it works. It's not how it works. There's a litany of factors. Sometimes there's a gray area. If Colby Covington had 3 really solid wins, meanwhile Belal Muhammad has 9 wins, and maybe only 3 of them are really good, and Colby's drawing more pay-per-view buys, maybe then you can go with Colby and you can make that argument. But 1 win against a guy who's not even ranked, who's retired on his way out at the time he beat him, and has sat out for over a year, makes absolutely no sense. So moving on to whether or not Colby Covington is a draw, I want to take a look at some of the actual numbers that we have. And we have some numbers from when Colby Covington fought Robbie Lawler, and they main evented on UFC ESPN 5. And if you go off this, it says represented the worst performing of the first 5 UFC events on the network. While the event amassed 680,000 viewers, fellow welterweights Leon Edwards and Rafael dos Anjos comfortably surpassed it with 957,000 viewers, as did lightweights Edson Barboza and Justin Gaethje, who drew 828,000 eyeballs. So you go back then, I know it was a decent amount of time ago. He wasn't drawing very well on free ESPN. Rafael dos Anjos and Leon Edwards drew more eyeballs than Colby Covington. Now, I do understand that this was like a late afternoon time slot, and you can say, okay, because of that, maybe that's why he didn't get the ratings that maybe he could have. But you think if Conor McGregor fought at that time, you think he would get eyeballs on him? Yes, he would. But let's just forget about that because that's kind of in the past. Let's move on to something more recent. UFC 268. We have numbers for UFC 268. This was Kamaru Usman versus Colby Covington 2. And if you look at UFC 268, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but they did a rough estimate of 700,000 pay-per-view buys according to the Sports Business Journal. And I think that's pretty good buy rate for UFC 268. But you have to look at the fact Kamaru Usman being a dominant champion, also UFC 268 was absolutely stacked. Absolutely stacked. So you have to take that all into account. And then you take all that into account, it still did 700,000 buys. 700,000 buys is good. Don't get me wrong. But it's not some blockbuster 1 million sale pay-per-view at all. And what I also wanted to take a look at, because I think you can really put it into context, you look at UFC 270 or 251, because this is Kamaru Usman versus Jorge Masvidal at that same point in time. And you look at UFC 251, what did that do? 1.3 million pay-per-view buys. So Kamaru Usman versus Jorge Masvidal did 1.3 million pay-per-view buys. Compare that to the 700,000 Kamaru Usman and Colby did roughly over a year later. It doesn't look all that great now. It doesn't look all that great now. UFC 251 was also very stacked, but I think UFC 251 and UFC 268 were very comparable in terms of the quality of the card and substantially 600,000 pay-per-views less for Usman versus Covington 2. Now, also, I do believe you have to take into account UFC 251 was dead center of the pandemic, so more people were at home, more people were potentially buying pay-per-views. I do believe you can put that in context and say that, but nonetheless, 600,000 pay-per-views less for Kamaru Usman versus Colby Covington 2 versus Kamaru Usman versus Jorge Masvidal at UFC 251. Now, the reason I think that's also very important to note is because what was Colby Covington's last fight? It was the first time he headlined a pay-per-view without a title on the line, and it was against Jorge Masvidal. So perfect. We can compare it. Kamaru Usman versus Jorge Masvidal, and now we have Colby Covington versus Jorge Masvidal. Now, we don't have definitive numbers on what UFC 272 Covington versus Masvidal did, but we can all agree, going into that fight, Jorge Masvidal is the bigger draw. There's no doubt about that. They had the entire backstory beef, best friends, turned foes. It was hyped up by the UFC. It was promoted by the UFC. Wasn't the greatest card. But we have a report by the Sports Business Journal that we look at UFC 274, which was Charles Oliveira versus Justin Gaethje, not a particularly stacked card. That did the best of the year in 2022 up until that point, and it did 400,000 pay-per-view buys. So that means Colby Covington versus Jorge Masvidal did under 400,000 pay-per-view buys. Maybe it did 300, maybe it did 350, but it did under 400,000 pay-per-view buys. Compare that to Kamaru Usman versus Masvidal, 1.3 million pay-per-view buys. So you really start to compare it, it's not looking like Colby Covington's that big of a draw because he's fighting a bigger draw in Jorge Masvidal. They have the complete backstory there, to really promote it, and they're only doing under 400,000 pay-per-view buys. Let's just call it maybe 350, to be generous. Maybe it did 300. I don't know. But we know it did under 400,000 buys based on legitimate reporting. So now that brings me to, what will Colby Covington versus Leon Edwards do? What will that do in terms of pay-per-view buys? It's for the title, but Leon Edwards isn't really a draw. And the same people that are saying Belal Muhammad doesn't deserve a title shot were the same people saying that Leon Edwards didn't deserve a title shot. And Belal Muhammad has a better resume right now to get a title shot than Leon Edwards did when he got his title shot. And I was defending Leon Edwards all the way, saying Leon Edwards deserves a title shot. Most people, a lot of fans were saying he didn't. But what does Leon Edwards defending his welterweight title against Colby Covington do? Well, there's not some incredible backstory. Leon Edwards is not a draw by any means. So I think we can comfortably assume it would do less than Colby Covington versus Jorge Masvidal, which, let's be generous, let's say it did 350,000 pay-per-view buys. So let's say Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington does 325,000 pay-per-view buys, 300,000 pay-per-view buys, somewhere in that range, maybe even comparable, maybe even close to the Masvidal-Colby number of 350, but we can comfortably say it will do under 350,000 pay-per-view buys. Well, that doesn't sound all that great, and this is where my problem with it is. And I'm going to get to my point about Belal Muhammad being a bigger draw in a second. But if you look at Colby Covington's drawing history based on actual factual evidence and not just, oh, well, he talks like he's from the WWE and he has corny lines, so he must be a draw. I don't believe that Colby Covington brings in any casuals. I do not believe that at all. He's not. Conor McGregor, when he fights, there is fans that do not watch MMA that are tuning in to see Conor McGregor fight. You cannot take that away from him because he's an exciting fighter and because he's very well-spoken and good at trash talking. Colby Covington's not bringing in casual fans. He's not bringing in casual fans. So we can comfortably say Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington is going to do under 350K pay-per-view buys. Well, what about Belal's star power? We don't really have any info. We don't have any ratings. He's never headlined a pay-per-view. Even back at UFC 280, he was on the prelims. So we can comfortably say that Belal Muhammad's not some pay-per-view star. And people keep saying draw, and I think they're using that word very loosely because it used to be a draw was like, okay, they're doing like over 700,000 pay-per-view buys, over 1 million pay-per-view buys was considered a draw. But, I think it's using it very loosely, but we can say comfortably that Belal Muhammad is not some substantial draw. He's not going to draw over 1 million pay-per-view buys. He's not going to draw over 500,000 pay-per-view buys. He's never headlined a pay-per-view by himself. So what does Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad do? Well, we can look at the UFC past to predict the future. And typically for a low-level UFC pay-per-view that's not particularly stacked, that doesn't have a big main event, even let's reference UFC 288. Not the biggest card, not stacked, not the greatest main event. Aljamain Sterling, a champion that not a lot of people like. Henry Cejudo was gone for 3 years. Nobody even cared that he disappeared. Well, according to Aljamain Sterling, that did about 250,000 pay-per-view buys. So you cannot convince me that Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad 2 would do less than Henry Cejudo versus Aljamain Sterling. So then we can accurately assume, giving an educated guess based on the actual evidence we have, we can assume that Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad would do over 250,000 pay-per-view buys. So we're talking about, okay, Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington does probably under 350,000 pay-per-view buys, and Belal Muhammad versus Leon Edwards does over 250,000 pay-per-view buys. So that's pretty close. That's pretty comparable. And I know people are going to say, well, you said Belal Muhammad was the bigger draw. Let's get to that point. Because the UFC has a deal with Abu Dhabi, okay? And people don't quite understand this deal. And it's not really widely talked about enough. But what happens is the UFC will hold amazing pay-per-views in Abu Dhabi. And they'll do it in prime time for Abu Dhabi fans to watch live. And they'll do it in the afternoon for the United States or the North American fans. And they'll lose pay-per-view buys on that. They'll do, a 2 o'clock pay-per-view. They'll lose pay-per-view buys because Abu Dhabi is paying them. They are paying the UFC millions to make up for the pay-per-view loss just so they can have it in prime time in Abu Dhabi for the live audience. Well, what has the UFC done the last few times they went to Abu Dhabi? Well, you look back at UFC 280, they did Islam Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira. They did this pay-per-view in the afternoon, and they stacked the card. And guess what? Who was headlining the card? A Muslim, Islam Makhachev. Because Abu Dhabi, and we've seen this time and time again with the UFC, they like to take people to an area where the live audience will be attracted there, okay? So they take Brazilian guys like Glover Teixeira, they put him in Brazil at UFC 283. And there's countless examples of this. I don't need to go through the entire list. They try to make it where a fighter, they have like a hometown, audience almost, where they can root for a certain fighter in the main event based on their nationality or based on their religion. And in the past, UFC 280, you can go back to UFC 254 with Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Justin Gaethje. You can go back to UFC 242, which was Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Dustin Poirier. The UFC likes to take a Muslim and put them in the main event of a UFC pay-per-view held in Abu Dhabi. And guess what Belal Muhammad happens to be? He happens to be Muslim. So in my opinion, if the UFC decides to put Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad at UFC 294, where Leon Edwards has said, I want to fight in Abu Dhabi at UFC 294, well, guess who sells more tickets in Abu Dhabi? I think Belal Muhammad will. Because the fans there, it's in the Middle East, the predominant religion is Muslim. Belal Muhammad is Muslim. They're going to want to root for Belal Muhammad. And we've seen the UFC do this time and time again with nationality, and in this case, with religion. Khabib Nurmagomedov, case in point, I've already talked about multiple events. So in my opinion, if the UFC is going to put Leon Edwards in Abu Dhabi at UFC 294, which he has requested, I believe the bigger fight is Belal Muhammad because it will drive a higher gate and it will drive better ticket sales. You think the people in Abu Dhabi want to see Colby Covington fight? I mean, that'd be funny to see, honestly. He'd be hated there for sure because some of the offhand remarks he makes. And also, I think people are misunderstanding my point. I don't think Colby Covington is a bad fighter. I think he's a very good fighter. But the point is, we can't just distribute out title shots because we think this guy is a draw or this guy's not a draw because he says corny lines. Colby Covington is the power slap fighter of the UFC. Essentially, because he gets online analytics and online clicks, whether it be Instagram posts or YouTube interview clicks, people pretend like that makes him a draw. YouTube clicks, Instagram views, Instagram watches do not translate to pay-per-view sales. It does not. And I'm not saying that Belal Muhammad sells more pay-per-views, but when the UFC is in Abu Dhabi, because of the deal they have with the Abu Dhabi government, they don't care about the pay-per-view sales. They only care about the live gate because Abu Dhabi makes up for it by paying them a large sum of money to hold a big event there. And then also you have Leon Edwards, who's openly said, I don't want to fight Colby Covington. Colby Covington turned me down. I wanted to fight Colby Covington. He turned me down, said, he's not fighting me. I don't want to fight him. He doesn't deserve it. So if we have Leon Edwards campaign for Belal Muhammad, that's going to happen in October. UFC 294 is going to happen in October. There's still a chance that we get Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad 2 in October in Abu Dhabi. And I believe in that specific set of circumstances, you can consider Belal Muhammad the bigger draw because Colby Covington isn't going to sell as many tickets, in my opinion, in Abu Dhabi because you have Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington. The fans there aren't really going to have someone to root for. Of course, they can pick one of the fighters. They'll probably pick Leon Edwards because he's from the UK, and there's no problem with that as well. But I'm just saying that draw argument is out the window when you look at it from that point of view. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much for watching.